In the tranquil hills of Virginia's Oakridge Valley, 95-year-old Margaret Maggie Williams was about to teach a ruthless criminal syndicate a lesson they'd never forget. When the notorious Shadow Valley Syndicate tried to force her off her historic Willow Creek Farm, they thought they were dealing with a helpless, elderly woman. What they didn't know was that her grandson was an elite Navy SEAL commander with over 200 successful combat missions. What began as simple intimidation would expose one of the largest criminal enterprises on the East Coast, leading to an extraordinary showdown that would change a small town forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've got something extra special coming your way. Frost-painted delicate patterns across the ancient apple trees of Willow Creek Farm as Maggie Williams stepped onto her wraparound porch. Her hands, though marked by nearly a century of hard work, remained steady as she lifted her morning coffee to her lips. The steam rose in the crisp Virginia air as she surveyed the land her family had worked for 5 generations. Riverside Junction had always been a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where doors stayed unlocked at night, and where the biggest excitement usually came from the annual Heritage Apple Festival. But something had changed in recent months. New faces had appeared in town, bringing with them an undercurrent of tension that Maggie recognized all too well from her long years of watching the world change around her. The rumble of engines drew her attention to the gravel driveway where 3 black SUVs approached, their pristine finish strange against the weathered backdrop of her historic barn. Maggie set her coffee cup down carefully on the porch railing, her expression unchanging as the vehicles came to a stop. Victor Blackwood stepped out of the lead vehicle, his expensive suit and polished shoes marking him as an outsider. 2 men flanked him, their casual postures betraying military training to Maggie's experienced eye. She'd seen enough soldiers, in her time, including her own grandson, to recognize the way they carried themselves. "Mrs. Williams," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying false warmth. "Beautiful morning for a chat about your property." "Mr. Blackwood," Maggie's voice remained steady, "I believe I made my position clear last week. This farm isn't for sale." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached the porch steps. "The property values in this area are rising. Mrs. Williams, our offer is more than generous. You have to admit, at your age, managing a farm this size must be challenging." "I've faced bigger challenges than property developers, Mr. Blackwood." Maggie's blue eyes met his without flinching. "My husband and I rebuilt this farm after the flood of '55. Our daughter learned to walk on these floorboards. My grandson climbed these apple trees before he learned to read. Some things are worth more than money." A shadow crossed Blackwood's face, his practiced charm slipping for just a moment. "Mrs. Williams, I don't think you understand the opportunity we're offering. Times are changing. Riverside Junction is changing. You don't want to be left behind." The threat in his words hung in the morning air. Behind him, his men had spread out, their casual observation of the farm buildings anything but casual to Maggie's watchful gaze. "I understand perfectly," Maggie replied, her voice cooling. "I understand that legitimate businessmen don't need 3 carloads of muscle to make a real estate offer. I understand that your kind of change isn't what this town needs." Blackwood stepped closer, 1 foot on the bottom porch step. "Your kind of stubborn pride can be dangerous, Mrs. Williams. Accidents happen on farms all the time, especially to elderly women living alone." Maggie didn't back away. Instead, she smiled slightly, the expression making Blackwood pause. "You know what else I understand, Mr. Blackwood? I understand that you and your Shadow Valley boys think you can bully an old woman off her land. But you've made 2 serious mistakes." "Is that right?" Blackwood's amusement carried an edge of menace. "And what mistakes would those be?" "First," Maggie said calmly. "You assumed I was alone." She nodded toward her front window, where the morning sun glinted off something metallic within. "I may be old, but I'm far from helpless." Blackwood's men tensed, hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons. "And the second mistake?" Blackwood asked, his voice hardening. "You assumed I wouldn't recognize what you really are." Maggie's voice carried the weight of decades of experience. "I've seen your kind before, men who think strength comes from fear, who think they can take whatever they want. My late husband fought against men like you in Korea. My grandson fights them now." At the mention of her grandson, something flickered in Blackwood's eyes. "Your grandson, the Navy SEAL," he laughed, but there was uncertainty in it. "He's not here now, is he? Deployed somewhere far away, I'd guess, unable to help his poor grandmother." Maggie reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. "That's where you're wrong again, Mr. Blackwood. Jim's actually expecting my call right about now." The atmosphere shifted perceptibly, Blackwood's men exchanging glances, their confident postures wavering slightly. "This is your final warning, Mrs. Williams." Blackwood's voice dropped to a growl. "Take our offer. Things are going to change. Around here, one way or another. Don't make us do this the hard way." "No, Mr. Blackwood, this is your final warning." Maggie's fingers hovered over her phone's keypad. "Leave my property now while you still can, because if I make this call, everything changes, and not in the way you're planning." For a long moment, tension crackled through the morning air. Then Blackwood stepped back, adjusting his suit jacket with forced casualness. "We'll be in touch, Mrs. Williams. Think carefully about your position, about your future." As the SUVs pulled away, Maggie watched until their dust trail disappeared down the road. Only then did her hands begin to shake slightly. She looked down at her phone, at the number she'd memorized, but never had to use before. Until now. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Gran, everything okay?" Maggie took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Jim, remember when you said to call if I ever needed help, if I ever felt threatened?" There was a moment of silence on the line. When Jim spoke again, his voice had changed, taking on the hard edge of a warrior. "What happened?" "The Shadow Valley Syndicate was just here. Their leader, Victor Blackwood, made it clear they won't take no for an answer." Maggie watched as a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the morning quiet. "I think it's time you came home, Jim. I think it's time we showed them what happens when they threaten the wrong family." At the Naval Special Warfare Command Briefing Room in Virginia Beach, Commander James Williams lowered his phone, his expression shifting from casual attention to focused intensity in the space of a single conversation. Lieutenant Thomas Reeves, his longtime teammate, recognized that look. It was the same one Jim wore before every high-stakes operation. "Sir?" Captain Harrison paused his tactical briefing, noting the change in his senior officer's demeanor. "I need emergency leave effective immediately." Jim's voice carried the quiet authority that had led men through dozens of combat missions. "Family situation." The word family carried weight in the SEAL teams. No further explanation was needed. Harrison nodded once, sharply. "Granted. Reeves, go with him. You've got 72 hours before we need you back for Operation Kingfisher." Outside the briefing room, Tom fell into step beside Jim. "Your grandmother." "Shadow Valley Syndicate," Jim moved with purpose toward their office. "They're pushing her to sell the farm. Made threats this morning." Tom's expression darkened. "The motorcycle gang that's been moving up from North Carolina. Thought they were just small-time dealers and thugs. Time to find out." Jim unlocked his laptop, fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. "Call Dan Rodriguez at the Chronicle. He's been tracking gang activity in the region, see what he knows." While Tom made the call, Jim pulled up satellite imagery of Riverside Junction. His eyes scanned the terrain he knew from childhood. The town had changed. New buildings on the outskirts, development pushing into what used to be open farmland. The Shadow Valley compound sat just outside town limits, a sprawling complex of buildings too new and too well-maintained for a simple motorcycle club. "Dan's got intel," Tom reported, covering the phone's mouthpiece. "Says the Shadow Valley Syndicate has been buying up property all along the county line, strong-arming locals, but keeping it just legal enough to avoid serious attention." Jim's jaw tightened. Willow Creek Farm backs up against federal land, high ground, clear sight lines to 3 major highways. Perfect spot for monitoring traffic. Tom's voice carried grim understanding. "Or coordinating shipments. This isn't about real estate development." Udum. The phone on Jim's desk rang, a secure line used only for sensitive operations. Tom answered, his expression growing more serious with each moment. "That was my contact at the DEA," he said after hanging up. "Shadow Valley's been on their radar. For months, they're suspected of running protection for a major cartel, but nothing solid enough for an indictment." Jim closed his laptop with decisive finality. "Then we'll have to get them something solid."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The drive to Virginia took 6 hours. They switched drivers every 2 hours, stopping only for fuel. Tom used the time to make calls, building a clearer picture of what they were facing. The Shadow Valley Syndicate had evolved from a standard motorcycle gang into something more sophisticated under Victor Blackwood's leadership. They'd maintained their outlaw biker image while developing a legitimate business front, buying properties and establishing political connections. Near sunset, they passed the "Welcome to Riverside Junction" sign. The town seemed unchanged at first glance. Same historic storefronts, same Blue Ridge Mountain backdrop, but Jim's trained eye caught the subtle differences. New security cameras on street corners, unfamiliar faces watching from doorways, local businesses closing earlier than he remembered. Grace Chen's diner still anchored the main street corner. Through the windows, Jim could see the usual evening crowd. Farmers, shopkeepers, the regulars who'd been fixtures of town life for decades. But there was tension in their postures, conversations held in lower voices. "Your grandmother's place first?" Tom asked as they approached the town limits. Jim shook his head. "Sheriff's office. Emma Parker needs to know we're here. We do this right by the book, for now." The sheriff's department occupied the same red brick building it had for 50 years. Sheriff Emma Parker stood as they entered, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "Jim Williams, about time you showed up. How bad is it, Emma?" The sheriff's weathered face tightened. "Worse than your grandmother's letting on. Shadow Valley's been systematically taking over the county. Small stuff at first, protection money from businesses, controlling the local drug trade, but they're getting bolder. 2 barn fires in the last month. No proof, of course." "And the town council?" Jim asked, though he suspected the answer. "Mayor Grayson's in their pocket." Emma's disgust was evident. "He blocks every attempt at serious investigation, claims we're harassing legitimate businessmen." Tom studied the incident map on the wall. "You've got the pattern marked. They're moving systematically, taking control of key transport routes." Emma nodded. "Started right after Blackwood bought the old Thompson estate. Been expanding ever since. Your grandmother's farm is the last piece they need to control the whole northern corridor." "Then they're not getting it." Jim's voice carried absolute certainty. "But we need to be smart about this." "Jim," Emma's voice stopped him as they turned to leave. "These aren't your usual troublemakers. Blackwood's people are professionals, military trained, some of them. They're building something big here." "I know." Jim met her gaze steadily. "That's why we're going to tear it down, piece by piece." The sun had set by the time they pulled up to Willow Creek Farm. Lights burned in the kitchen window, and the porch light snapped on as they approached. Margaret Williams stepped out, straight-backed and dignified as ever. "You made good time," she said simply, as if Jim had just been away for the weekend instead of 2 years. Jim hugged her carefully, noting how she felt smaller than he remembered, yet no less strong. "Brought some help. This is Tom Reeves, my teammate." Maggie nodded to Tom, then looked at her grandson with eyes that had seen too much trouble lately. "They'll be watching, Blackwood's people, they always are these days." "Good." Jim's smile was slight but dangerous. "Let them watch. Let them see exactly who they're dealing with." From the darkness beyond the farm's lights, unseen observers indeed watched the reunion. In the Shadow Valley compound, Victor Blackwood received the report of Commander Williams' arrival with carefully controlled anger. "So the old woman called her hero grandson after all?" He crushed out his cigarette with unnecessary force. "Fine. If that's how she wants to play it, we'll show them both what happens when you stand in our way." But as Blackwood began planning his response, he didn't notice the subtle changes already beginning in Riverside Junction. Word of Jim Williams's return spread through the town's whispered conversations. Long quiet spirits began to stir, and in homes and businesses across the county, people who'd lived too long in fear began to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally come who could stand against the darkness that had been growing in their midst. Dawn painted the Blue Ridge Mountains gold as Jim Williams walked Main Street, noting changes that wouldn't be visible to casual observers. New cameras mounted on buildings, fresh paint covering old brick businesses that suddenly had money for renovations, cars with out-of-state plates parked in strategic locations. Grace Chen's diner provided the perfect observation post. The morning crowd was sparse, conversations dying down as Jim entered. Grace herself brought coffee, her lined face showing relief. "Wasn't sure you'd come back," Grace said quietly, sliding into the booth. "Things have changed here, Jim. Not for the better." "Tell me." Grace glanced around before speaking. "Started small. Blackwood's people offering protection money. Those who refused had accidents, break-ins, vandalism. Then the offers to buy, always above market value. How many sold?" "Too many." Grace's voice carried resignation. "The Thompsons, the Reeves place, half the businesses on 3rd Street. Some were glad to take the money. Others didn't see a choice." The diner's door chimed. Dan Rodriguez entered, looking exactly as Jim remembered. Sharp eyes, missing nothing, notebook always ready. He slid into the booth without invitation. "Your timing's perfect," he said without preamble. "I've got something you need to see." He spread photographs across the table. Surveillance shots of the Shadow Valley compound, documentation of late-night meetings, financial records. "They're laundering money through legitimate businesses," Dan explained. "But that's just the surface. Look at these shipping manifests. Volumes too high for what these companies claim to be moving." Jim studied the documents. "You've been busy. And careful. Had to be. Last reporter who asked questions disappeared. Officially, he took a job in Seattle." Dan left the sentence hanging. Tom Reeves entered, taking position at the counter where he could watch the street. His posture was relaxed, but Jim recognized his combat-ready stance. "Mayor Grayson's involved," Dan continued. "He's been fast-tracking permits, blocking investigations. Shadow Valley's got half the county officials in their pocket." "Money trail?" Dan shook his head. "Offshore accounts, shell companies. Blackwood knows how to hide things. But look at these property acquisitions. They're creating a corridor." Jim saw the pattern. His grandmother's farm wasn't just valuable land. It was the final piece in a strategic network. The diner's door opened again. Eric Dawson, Blackwood's second-in-command, entered with 2 other Shadow Valley members. The morning customers tensed visibly. Dawson approached their booth, his friendly smile not reaching his eyes. "Jim Williams, heard you were back in town. Family reunion." Something like that. Jim's voice was neutral. but his slight shift in position put him between Dawson and Dan's documents. Sweet, looking after Grandma. That's respectable. Dawson leaned on the table. Hope you're not planning an extended stay, though. Town's changed. Might not be as welcoming as you remember. Grace Chen approached, coffee pot in hand. Everything all right here? Just greeting an old neighbor. Dawson straightened. Your grandmother's stubborn, Williams. Stubborn people tend to have accidents. That a threat, Dawson? Just an observation. Shame if anything happened to that nice farm, all alone out there. Tom chose that moment to turn from the counter, his movement deliberately drawing attention to the military-grade sidearm visible under his jacket. Dawson's smile tightened. Just being neighborly. Think about what I said. After they left, Dan gathered his documents quickly. They'll be watching now more than before. Good. Jim's expression was grimly satisfied. Let them watch. Meanwhile, we'll be watching too. Across town, Margaret Williams received another visitor. Mayor Richard Grayson himself arrived in his town council car, all political charm and practiced concern. Mrs. Williams, please be reasonable, he urged from her porch. These developers bring progress, jobs. The town needs this kind of investment. Is that what they're calling extortion now? Investment? Maggie's voice could have frozen summer. No one wants trouble, Grayson's tone carried warning, but trouble has a way of finding people who don't cooperate with progress. Interesting. Choice of words, Maggie smiled slightly. My grandson used to be a history teacher before he joined the SEALs. Taught me about how corruption works, how it spreads until good people start calling it progress. Grayson's facade cracked slightly. Your grandson needs to understand his place. This is bigger than one stubborn old woman's farm. Oh, I think he understands perfectly. Maggie's eyes were steel. Question is, do you understand yours? Because when this is over, everyone will know exactly where they stood, which side they chose. After Grayson left, Maggie called Jim. They're getting nervous. Grayson himself came to pressure me. We're finding interesting things, Jim replied. Keep the security system armed. Tom's setting up additional cameras tonight. They're planning something, Maggie warned. I can feel it. I know, but so are we. At the Shadow Valley compound, Victor Blackwood received updates from his various sources. Jim Williams had spent the morning gathering intelligence. The reporter was involved, and worse, others in town were beginning to take notice. Williams's got training, Eric Dawson warned him. Him and his friend both. This isn't some local cop we can intimidate. Blackwood's fist crashed onto his desk. I don't care if he's goddamn Superman. No one threatens what we're building here. No one. He pulled up satellite images of Willow Creek Farm on his computer. If they want to play soldiers, we'll show them what real war looks like. Make the calls. It's time to bring in some professional help. In town, people noticed changes, small ones at first. Jim Williams and Tom Reeves quietly talking to business owners, Dan Rodriguez openly taking photographs of Shadow Valley activities, and most significantly, the fear that had gripped Riverside Junction began to shift. Because for the first time in months, someone was standing up to the Shadow Valley Syndicate. Someone was asking questions, gathering evidence, and showing no fear of Victor Blackwood's threats. The storm was coming. Everyone could feel it. But this time, when it broke, the Shadow Valley Syndicate might find themselves facing more resistance than they'd bargained for. Because Jim Williams hadn't just come home to protect his grandmother's farm. He'd come to take back his town. Black SUVs with tinted windows began appearing in Riverside Junction. They moved with military precision, their drivers too professional to be ordinary thugs. Tom Reeves noticed them first, his combat experience recognizing the telltale signs. Ex-military, he told Jim, watching a pair of them case Main Street. Probably Blackwater or similar. Blackwood's bringing in serious muscle. Jim observed their movements from Grace Chen's diner. 4 teams that I've counted. They're setting up surveillance posts around town. Dan Rodriguez slipped into their booth, his voice low. Got something. Police scanner caught chatter about shipments coming through the old logging roads. Deputy Williams has been redirecting patrols away from those areas. Williams is one of theirs? Dan's expression darkened. Along with 3 other deputies, Sheriff Parker's been isolated, her most trusted officers reassigned to desk duty. The diner's regular customers were leaving larger tips than usual. Silent support for Grace Chen's willingness to let Jim use the place as an observation post. Small gestures of resistance were spreading through town. Jenny Thompson had refused to sell her bookstore despite escalating pressure. Frank O'Connor's garage had started offering free repairs to anyone the Shadow Valley had vandalized. The bell above the diner's door chimed. Victor Blackwood himself entered, flanked by 2 of his new professionals. The morning crowd fell silent. Blackwood slid into Jim's booth uninvited, his expensive suit out of place in the rustic diner. Williams, we should talk. Nothing to talk about. Jim's voice was neutral, but his posture shifted slightly, ready for anything. Actually, there is. Blackwood's smile was cold. See, you're interfering with business. Legitimate business, making my investors nervous. Legitimate? Jim's eyebrow raised. That why you need military contractors to protect your investment? Blackwood's facade cracked slightly. You have no idea what you're dealing with. This is bigger than your grandmother's stubborn pride, bigger than this whole backwoods town. That's where you're wrong. Jim met his gaze steadily. This town isn't backwards. It's just been waiting for someone to stand up to thugs like you. Careful, Williams. Blackwood's voice dropped dangerously. Heroes have a way of getting hurt. Sometimes their families, too. Tom chose that moment to approach, casual but purposeful. Blackwood's professionals tensed, hands moving beneath their jackets. Everything okay here, Jim? Before Blackwood could respond, Sheriff Emma Parker entered the diner. Her expression hardened at seeing Blackwood, but her voice remained professional. Mr. Blackwood, just the man I wanted to see. We've got some irregularities in your building. Permits to discuss. Blackwood stood smoothly. Another time, Sheriff, I was just leaving. He turned back to Jim. Think about what I said. Family should come first. After they left, Emma joined their booth. 4 of my deputies are on their payroll. Just got proof this morning. Bank records show regular payments through shell companies. Can you arrest them? Dan asked. Emma shook her head. Not without exposing our investigation. Besides, Mayor Grayson would have them released within hours. We need to let them think they're winning. Jim nodded toward the window. They're setting up surveillance on your grandmother's farm. Professional teams rotating shifts. Good. Tom's smile was grim. While they're watching us, they won't notice what we're really doing. At Willow Creek Farm, Maggie received visitors of a different kind. Jenny Thompson arrived with fresh baked goods. Frank O'Connor came to check her tractor, leaving behind a sophisticated security system. Grace Chen's daughter brought dinner and news about which local officials were in Shadow Valley's pocket. The Shadow Valley noticed this quiet parade of support. Blackwood's mercenaries photographed every visitor, logged every interaction. But they missed the subtle exchanges, the small packages passed, the quiet conversations that were building a network of resistance. In the sheriff's office, Emma Cooper met secretly with Jim and Tom after hours. Got something interesting from state police. Shadow Valley's been buying properties along 3 major trucking routes, all through shell companies, all traced back to offshore accounts. Drug corridors, Tom confirmed. They're setting up a distribution network. Your grandmother's farm would give them a clear route straight through to Canada. And surveillance positions overlooking every major approach, Jim added. They're building something big, professional. Emma spread a map across her desk. Grayson's been pushing through zoning changes, clearing the way for their expansion. But look at this. Every property they've bought connects to old mining roads, fire trails, or logging paths. Dan Rodriguez arrived through the back door, carrying files. Found records of similar operations in Colorado and Wyoming. Same pattern. They move in, buy key properties, corrupt local officials. Within 6 months, drug traffic in the area triples. But they made a mistake here, Jim said quietly. They thought they could intimidate an old woman off her land. Instead, they've given us the opening we need to bring down their whole operation. A crackle of static from Emma's radio interrupted them. Multiple vehicles approaching Willow Creek Farm. Armed subjects observed. Jim was already moving. They're making their play sooner than expected. Be careful, Emma warned. Blackwood's professionals won't hesitate to use lethal force. Neither will we. Jim's voice was cold. They wanted to play soldiers. Let's show them what real soldiers can do. As they drove toward the farm, Tom monitored radio traffic. The Shadow Valley was mobilizing in force, their mercenaries taking up tactical positions around the property. But what they didn't know was that Jim had spent the last 3 days preparing for exactly this scenario. Willow Creek Farm was no longer just a peaceful homestead. It was a trap, and the Shadow Valley was about to spring it. Night had fallen over Willow Creek Farm when the Shadow Valley Syndicate made their move. 6 vehicles approached with lights off, using the rolling terrain for cover. Their mercenaries deployed with professional precision, establishing a perimeter around the property. From their perspective, it looked like a straightforward intimidation operation. They were wrong. In the farmhouse, Margaret Williams sat calmly at her kitchen table, sipping chamomile tea. The lights were on, making her a clear silhouette in the window. Exactly as planned. Through her earpiece, she could hear Jim's quiet voice coordinating. Their response, just like we discussed, Gran, let them think they have the advantage. The first sign that something was wrong came when the mercenaries' radio communications suddenly filled with static. Tom Reeves had spent 2 days setting up interference equipment hidden in old farm equipment around the property. Communications compromised, one of the professionals reported, switching to hand signals. They maintained their approach, but with noticeably more caution. The second surprise came from the town. Trucks began arriving. Frank O'Connor's tow truck, Grace Chen's delivery van, a half-dozen local vehicles driven by men and women who'd finally had enough of living in fear. They parked along the access road, blocking the Shadow Valley's escape. "Route! What the hell is this?" Eric Dawson demanded, watching through binoculars from the command vehicle. The mercenaries' neat tactical formation was suddenly compromised, forced to split their attention. Jim's voice came clearly over their interrupted radio frequencies. "This is private property. You have 10 seconds to withdraw." Victor Blackwood's voice crackled with rage as he grabbed the radio. "Williams, you're making a big mistake. Clear these vehicles or we'll clear them ourselves." "Last warning," Jim replied calmly. "Leave now." 2 mercenaries advanced on the farm's main gate. The moment they touched it, lights blazed to life. Powerful floodlights mounted on the barn and outbuildings turned night into day. The professionals found themselves illuminated, their positions exposed. "Sniper teams, you have targets?" Blackwood demanded. Silence answered him. His sniper teams, positioned in the hills overlooking the farm, had found their scopes mysteriously painted over, the work of local hunters who knew every trail and approach to the property. Sheriff Emma Parker's voice cut through the chaos. "This is the police. I'm receiving reports of armed individuals threatening civilians. All units respond." Blackwood recognized the trap too late. If his men engaged now, they'd be doing it in front of witnesses, with police en route. His carefully maintained facade of legitimate business would crumble. "Pull back," he ordered through gritted teeth. "Tactical withdrawal, now!" The mercenaries began retreating, their professional demeanor cracking as locals used phones to film their every move. Dan Rodriguez was there too, documenting everything. But the Shadow Valley had one last card to play. As the main force withdrew, two men broke from the group, rushing toward the barn with Molotov cocktails. They never made it. Tom Reeves emerged from the shadows, his military training evident in every movement. One precise strike disarmed the first man. The second found himself facing Jim Williams, who seemed to materialize from nowhere. The fight was brief, controlled, and decisive. Both attackers were subdued without a single shot fired, zip-tied, and left for the approaching police. When the police arrived, they found a curious scene. Armed mercenaries in retreat, their tactical operation disrupted by simple preparation and community action. Two would-be arsonists in custody and dozens of witnesses with video evidence of the entire attempt. Blackwood watched his plans unravel from his command vehicle, fury building. "This isn't over, Williams," he shouted into the radio. "Actually, it is," Jim replied. "You just gave us probable cause to investigate every vehicle and individual involved in tonight's attempt." Sheriff Emma Parker's voice held satisfaction. "Already got the warrants." Judge Mitchell was happy to sign them after seeing the evidence of attempted assault and arson. The search of the Shadow Valley vehicles revealed more than they'd intended. Police found military-grade weapons, communications equipment, and, most damaging of all, detailed maps of drug trafficking routes through the county. In the farmhouse, Maggie finally set down her teacup. "Well, that was exciting." Jim entered, checking her over despite knowing she'd been perfectly safe. "You okay, Gran?" "Of course," she smiled slightly, "though I suspect we've just stirred up a hornet's nest." That was the plan. Jim watched through the window as police processed the scene. They had to show their hand eventually. Now we have proof of their real operations. Tom joined them, his expression serious. "Found something in their vehicles. Documentation linking them to cartel operations in 3 states. Blackwood's operation is bigger than we thought." "Good," Jim's voice was grim. "The bigger they are, the harder they fall." At the Shadow Valley compound, Victor Blackwood was discovering just how badly the night's operation had gone wrong. His phone rang, a secure line used only for emergencies. "You assured us the situation was under control." The cartel representative's voice was cold. "Now we have police searching vehicles containing sensitive information. This is unacceptable." "I'll handle it," Blackwood promised, sweat beading on his forehead. "You'd better. You have 24 hours to clean this up. After that, we'll send someone to handle it our way." Blackwood slammed down the phone, his carefully constructed plans crumbling around him. He'd underestimated Jim Williams, underestimated the town's willingness to resist, but he still had options. Dangerous ones. "Call our friends in state government," he ordered Eric Dawson. "Tell them to shut down Parker's investigation. Then, get me everything you can find on Williams's military record, his missions, his teammates, everything." "Sir," Dawson hesitated, "those records are classified. Not to everyone." Blackwood's smile was vicious. "Time to show Williams what real warfare looks like." But even as he plotted his counterattack, Blackwood failed to notice how the night's events had changed things in Riverside Junction. People who'd lived in fear were standing taller. Those who'd stayed silent were finding their voices. The war for the soul of the town was just beginning, and the Shadow Valley Syndicate was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the most weapons. It's a community that's finally decided to fight back. Morning brought the first wave of Blackwood's counterattack. State police cruisers rolled into Riverside Junction, carrying investigators from the Attorney General's office. Their first stop was the Sheriff's Department, where they served Emma Parker with orders to surrender all evidence from the previous night's incident. "This investigation has been reassigned to the state level," the lead investigator announced, producing paperwork signed by senior officials. "All materials are to be turned over immediately." Emma's response was polite but firm. Interesting. Timing. Especially since I already sent copies of everything to the FBI's field office in Richmond. At Willow Creek Farm, Maggie received an official visit from county health inspectors, environmental regulators, and tax assessors, all arriving simultaneously, all finding sudden urgent reasons to examine her property. Your agricultural permits seem to be out of date, one official declared, shuffling through papers, and there are concerns about watershed contamination. We may need to suspend all farming operations pending review. Is that so? Maggie's voice could have frozen hell itself. Interesting that my permits were perfectly valid last week when Mr. Blackwood wanted to buy the property. Across town, Jim and Tom monitored the situation from Grace Chen's diner, which had become their unofficial headquarters. Dan Rodriguez arrived with fresh intelligence. Blackwood's called in every political favor he has, he reported, spreading documents across the table. But he's burning bridges doing it. Look at these financial transfers. He's paying out big money to keep people in line. Tom studied the papers. He's getting desperate, making mistakes. There's more. Dan lowered his voice. 2 cartel representatives checked into the Mountain View Hotel this morning, traveling under business cover, but my contact at the front desk recognized the signs. Jim's expression darkened. Blackwood's bosses are getting nervous. The diner's door opened, admitting Jenny Thompson, her face showing barely controlled anger. They just condemned my bookstore. Health violations they've never found in 20 years of inspections. How many other businesses? Jim asked. 6 or 7, all people who helped last night. Grace Chen set coffee cups in front of them with deliberate calm. They tried that here too, but seems their inspector got lost on the way. Won't be able to make it until next week. Jim caught the gleam in Grace's eye. The community was learning to fight back in its own ways. At the sheriff's department, Emma Parker faced another crisis. Her corrupt deputies had chosen this moment to file formal complaints against her. Alleged misconduct and abuse of power. It's a coordinated effort to remove you, Paul Andrews, one of her few trusted deputies, reported. They're pushing for an emergency hearing with the town council. Let them push, Emma replied. Meanwhile, get me everything you can on Deputy Williams's bank records. Dan Rodriguez says he's been making interesting purchases lately. The afternoon brought more pressure. Tax liens appeared on properties owned by Willow Creek Farm supporters. Building inspectors discovered urgent violations requiring immediate closure of resistant businesses. Blackwood's political machinery was working overtime, but resistance was growing. When inspectors tried to close Frank O'Connor's garage, they found 30 customer vehicles blocking access, their owners nowhere to be found. Jenny Thompson's bookstore remained open despite condemnation orders, supported by a constant stream of customers daring officials to arrest them. At the Shadow Valley compound, Victor Blackwood met with the cartel representatives. Their displeasure was evident. This attention is unacceptable, the senior representative, a man who called himself Mr. Ortiz, stated coldly. Your operation was supposed to be invisible. I can handle Williams, Blackwood insisted. We've got leverage now, look. He opened a folder containing classified military documents, details of Jim's SEAL operations, mission reports, names of team members. Our source came through. Williams's team was involved in some controversial operations. One leaked to the right media outlets. Ortiz cut him off. You don't understand. The cartel doesn't want exposure. Any exposure. Fix this or we'll fix it ourselves. As the meeting ended, Tom's surveillance equipment captured every word. He and Jim listened from their hidden observation post near the compound. They're going to move against us soon, Tom noted. Blackwood's lost control. The cartel won't trust him much longer. Good. Jim checked his watch. Dan's story about the corrupt deputies breaks tomorrow. Emma's got enough evidence to force an internal investigation. They'll try to stop the story, counting on it. Sometimes you have to let the enemy think they're winning. Back at Willow Creek Farm, Maggie sat on her porch, watching police cars periodically drive past. The surveillance was obvious now, intimidation replacing subtlety. Her phone rang. Mayor Richard Grayson. "Mrs. Williams," his voice oozed false concern. "The town council is very worried about these violations on your property, but there might be a way to resolve everything quickly." "Save your breath, Mr. Grayson," Maggie interrupted. "Better start worrying about yourself. I understand the FBI takes a dim view of officials who help drug traffickers." Grayson's facade cracked. You have no idea what you're dealing with. None of you do." "Actually," Maggie smiled slightly, "I don't think you know what you're dealing with, but you're about to find out." As night fell, tension gripped Riverside Junction. The Shadow Valley's political pressure had revealed the depth of their corruption, but also its limits. Every act of intimidation sparked new resistance. Every threat exposed new weaknesses. In the darkness, a convoy of unmarked vehicles crossed the county line, heading toward town. The cartel was done waiting. They were sending professionals to eliminate the problem permanently. But Jim Williams had spent his career dealing with professionals, and this time he wasn't fighting alone. The war for Riverside Junction was about to enter a new phase, and the enemy was about to learn that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't a gun or a badge, it's the truth itself. The Riverside Junction Chronicle's headline hit like a thunderbolt. "Corruption in uniform, deputies' secret payoffs exposed." Dan Rodriguez's article detailed every corrupt transaction, every compromised investigation, complete with bank records and witness statements. By sunrise, the story had spread through town like wildfire. Deputy Williams's rage manifested in a kicked-in door at the newspaper office. He found it empty. Dan had anticipated this reaction, working remotely from a secured location. But the violence marked a turning point. The Shadow Valley's facade of legitimacy was cracking. At the sheriff's department, Emma Parker moved. "Quickly, Paul, take a team. Arrest Williams and Morris. The evidence is solid now." But Williams had disappeared, along with 3 other implicated deputies. Their patrol cars were found abandoned at the Shadow Valley compound. Jim and Tom monitored the situation from their observation post. "They're consolidating," Tom noted, watching through high-powered optics, bringing their compromised assets in for protection. "More than that," Jim replied. "Look at the new arrivals." 3 unmarked vans had entered the compound. Men emerged with military precision, carrying equipment cases, not local muscle. These were professional killers. "Cartel cleaners," Tom confirmed. "Ortiz isn't waiting for Blackwood to fix this anymore." In town, the morning brought escalation. Jenny Thompson arrived at her bookstore to find the windows smashed, but her customers formed a human chain, helping clean up and maintain business as usual. Frank O'Connor's garage became a staging area for impromptu security patrols by local veterans. Grace Chen's diner remained the nerve center of resistance. "They hit 4 businesses overnight," Grace reported to Jim. "But something's changed. People aren't backing down anymore." The police scanner crackled with reports of armed men conducting inspections of businesses that had supported Willow Creek Farm. But these weren't Blackwood's usual thugs. They moved with professional efficiency, leaving subtle but clear threats. Maggie Williams's morning began with a visit from Mayor Grayson and 2 state police officers. "We have a warrant to search the property," Grayson announced, waving papers. "Environmental violations. Step aside." Maggie stood in her doorway, unmoved. "Interesting. The warrant signed by Judge Mitchell, who I just got off the phone with. He never saw these papers." Grayson's face twisted. "Mrs. Williams, don't make this difficult." "Oh, it's already difficult," Maggie interrupted. "For you, because while you were trying to intimidate an old woman, you didn't notice the FBI surveillance team photographing this entire attempt at illegal entry. As if on cue, an unmarked federal vehicle rolled into view. Grayson's police escorts, recognizing real federal agents, quickly withdrew. "This isn't over," Grayson snarled. "You're right about that," Maggie agreed calmly. "The FBI is very interested in corrupt officials using fake warrants to help drug traffickers. Across town, the cartel's professional killers began their work. Dan Rodriguez's car exploded when he turned the key, but he wasn't in it. Jim's warning had come just in time. Grace Chen's kitchen suffered a mysterious gas leak, except she'd already evacuated on Tom's advice. Each attempted hit failed, met with empty targets and prepared responses. The hunters were becoming the hunted. At the Shadow Valley compound, frustration boiled over. "How are they anticipating every move?" Ortiz demanded. Blackwood had no answer. His organization was coming apart. 3 of his lieutenants had already disappeared with significant cash. Others were making quiet deals with law enforcement. "Find Williams," Ortiz ordered. "Find him and end this, now." But Jim Williams was done hiding. He walked straight into the Mountain View Hotel's lobby, passing Ortiz's security as if they didn't exist. In the restaurant, he sat down across from the cartel representative. "Bold move," Ortiz commented, signaling his men to hold position. "Just delivering a message," Jim replied. "Every piece of evidence we have, every document, every recording, it all gets released to federal authorities if anything happens to anyone in this town. You're playing a dangerous game." "No game!" Jim's voice was steel. "You've got bigger problems coming. Blackwood's been skimming from your shipments, selling routes to your competitors. We've got proof of that too." Ortiz's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened on his water glass. "That's a serious accusation. Check your books. Check your missing shipments. Blackwood's been playing both sides, using your money to build his own empire." Jim stood to leave. Ortiz's men tensed, but their boss waved them down. "If you're lying, Williams, you know I'm not. Blackwood's a liability now. The question is, how many of your operations will he expose when he falls?" The impact of Jim's revelations spread through the cartel's hierarchy like poison. Blackwood had no idea that his own allies were now his greatest threat. At Willow Creek Farm, Maggie received another visitor, Eric Dawson, Blackwood's second in command. But something was different about this visit. "Mrs. Williams," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder, "there are some things you need to know about Blackwood's real plans, about who's really behind all this." Inside the farmhouse, Dawson spread documents across her kitchen table, evidence of something far bigger than a local drug operation, something that reached into the highest levels of state government. "Blackwood's just a middle manager," Dawson explained. "The real power, it goes all the way to the capital." The truth was bigger and uglier than anyone had imagined. The Shadow Valley Syndicate wasn't just a gang. They were pawns in a massive criminal enterprise that used Virginia's rural spaces for international drug trafficking. And now, with pressure building from all sides, that enterprise was about to explode into violence that would change Riverside Junction forever. Because the cartel wasn't just sending killers now, they were sending an army. And the war for the soul of a small Virginia town was about to become something much more dangerous. The only question was who would survive when all the masks finally came off. Eric Dawson's documents exposed a network of corruption that stretched from Riverside Junction to the state capital. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and compromised officials created a web that had turned Virginia's remote highways into drug corridors worth millions. The Shadow Valley was just the muscle, Dawson explained, his hands shaking as he laid out more evidence. Blackwood thought he was building his own empire, but we were always just tools for bigger players. Maggie Williams studied the documents with steady eyes. Why come forward now? Because they're cleaning house. Dawson's fear was evident. The cartel's eliminating everyone who knows too much. Blackwood doesn't realize he's already dead. So are the rest of us. Before Dawson could continue, shots shattered the kitchen window. Maggie and Dawson hit the floor as bullets tore through the space where they'd been sitting. Tom Reeves's voice crackled over Maggie's concealed radio. Hostile team neutralized. You're clear, but we need to move. Jim arrived moments later, moving with combat-trained precision. Two-man sniper team, cartel professionals. Tom's got them zip-tied for Emma. In town, the violence escalated. Mayor Grayson's car exploded. Outside the town offices, the corrupt mayor survived, but the message was clear. The cartel was severing loose ends. Sheriff Emma Parker faced her own crisis. Her remaining corrupt deputies had barricaded themselves in the evidence room, destroying documents. But she'd anticipated this. All the real evidence is already safe, she told her trusted officers. Let them burn their copies. They're just proving their guilt. Dan Rodriguez broadcast live from a secured location, revealing document after document. State officials had accepted millions in bribes to ignore suspicious property purchases. Highway patrol routes were altered to leave drug corridors unmonitored. The Shadow Valley was given free rein to intimidate and control local communities. The Shadow Valley compound descended into chaos. Victor Blackwood found himself trapped between the cartel's cleaners and his own fracturing organization. 3 of his lieutenants were found dead in their homes. Others disappeared with cash and evidence, running for their lives. It's over, Blackwood. Eric Dawson's voice came through his phone. I've given them everything. The only way any of us survive is to come clean. Blackwood's response was predictable. He ordered his remaining loyal men to hunt down Dawson, but his authority was crumbling. Each order was questioned, each command met with hesitation. At Grace Chen's diner, the community gathered in defiance of the growing danger. Local veterans established security patrols. Business owners shared resources and information. The atmosphere was tense but determined. They thought they could break us one by one, Grace told the crowded diner. Instead, they united us. Jim and Tom coordinated protection details from their makeshift command center. The cartel is moving fast now, Tom reported. 3 more hit teams identified entering the county. Let them come, Jim replied. Every move they make gives us more evidence. Emma's got federal task forces standing by. We just need to prove the connection to state officials. The proof came from an unexpected source. Mayor Richard Grayson, wounded and terrified after the attempt on his life, arrived at the sheriff's department ready to talk. I'll tell you everything, he babbled. Names, dates, recordings, just keep me alive. But the cartel had anticipated this. As Grayson began his confession, power to the sheriff's department was cut. In the momentary darkness, shots were fired with surgical precision. Emma Parker's quick thinking saved Grayson's life. But the message was clear. The cartel would eliminate every threat, no matter how well protected. Maggie Williams received the news at her farm, now guarded by a volunteer force of local veterans and trusted deputies. They're getting desperate, she observed. Desperate is dangerous, Jim agreed. But it's also sloppy. Every attack exposes more of their operation. Dan Rodriguez's broadcast continued, revealing more documents. The Shadow Valley property purchases weren't random. They were creating a network of safe houses and monitoring posts along major trafficking routes. But the real money didn't come from drugs. It came from selling information about federal law enforcement operations to multiple cartels. The revelation exploded through criminal networks like a bomb. Blackwood had been playing different cartels against each other, selling tactical information to the highest bidders. Ortiz, the cartel representative, received orders from his superiors. Eliminate Blackwood and every member of his organization. Leave no traces, no witnesses, but as night fell over Riverside Junction, the cartel's hit teams found themselves in unfamiliar territory. Local veterans who knew every back road and hunting trail, farmers who could spot strangers from miles away, a community that had decided to stop being victims. Blackwood, realizing his position was untenable, made one last, desperate move. "If I'm going down," he told his remaining loyal men, "I'm taking this whole town with me." He didn't realize that his words were being recorded, transmitted to multiple secure locations, evidence that would ensure there was no turning back. The war for Riverside Junction had moved beyond threats and intimidation. Now, it was about survival, and in the coming hours, everyone would have to choose a side, because the next sunrise would bring either liberation or destruction. There was no middle ground left. Deep beneath Riverside Junction, in the lowest level of an old civil war storage cellar beneath the Shadow Valley compound, countdown clocks ticked toward zero. Warning lights flashed on long, dormant control panels. Emergency protocols, older than most of the Shadow Valley's members, activated automatically. "It's not just another fail-safe," Tom Reeves reported, studying decoded blueprints. "The entire compound network was built around this. Everything else was just camouflage." Jim recognized the implications immediately. They weren't just hiding from the law, they were hiding something from themselves. Victor Blackwood's calm facade finally cracked. "You don't understand. It was never supposed to activate, just exist as a final guarantee, the ultimate threat, to maintain control." At Willow Creek Farm, Maggie faced Blackwood's admission with characteristic steadiness. "What exactly is buried under my land, Mr. Blackwood?" "Insurance," Blackwood whispered. "Proof that this region needs control, needs the Shadow Valley, even if we have to demonstrate it conclusively." Sheriff Emma Parker coordinated emergency response teams as sensors detected growing instability beneath the town. Ground-penetrating radar shows movement in the deep structures. Something's changing down there. Dan Rodriguez's investigation revealed fragments of the truth. The original military project before the Shadow Valley took over, it wasn't about crime or drugs. It was about leverage, about having the ultimate threat to maintain control. The cartel representatives, watching their operation crumble, showed real fear for the first time. "You have to reinstate our control," they insisted. "The failsafe can't be stopped any other way." Jim and Tom led teams into the deepest facility level. The security systems here were different, older, more primitive, but deadlier. Not designed to protect information or maintain secrecy, but to guard something far more dangerous. Civil. War-era tunnels, Tom noted, bypassing ancient electronic locks. This facility predates everything else. The Shadow Valley just built their network around it. The truth emerged level by level. The Shadow Valley hadn't created the original threat. They'd discovered it, found a weapons cache so terrible that its mere existence guaranteed control, built their entire organization around containing it while using its threat to maintain power. "We prevented worse catastrophes," Blackwood insisted. "Maintained peace through controlled fear. But now the containment protocols are failing. The failsafe will prove why we were necessary. By threatening everything to prove we need your protection?" Maggie's voice held steel. "That's not control. That's terrorism." The race to prevent the failsafe became desperate. Shadow Valley systems designed to be unstoppable fought every attempt at intervention. Automated defenses targeted anyone approaching crucial controls. Countdown clocks continued. Their relentless advance. Emma Parker managed evacuation preparations. "We can't move the whole town in time. Whatever's down there, we have to stop it here." Dan Rodriguez coordinated with state agencies. Similar facilities detected in other locations. The Shadow Valley built their entire network around containing these old weapons caches, used the threat to maintain control globally. The Shadow Valley's loyalists made their final stand, protecting the deepest controls, not fighting for power anymore, but from genuine belief that their control was necessary, that humans needed to be protected from the ultimate truth. "You think you're choosing freedom," Blackwood warned. "You're choosing extinction. Some truths are too dangerous to face." "No," Maggie countered. "The only truth too dangerous to face is that we've let people like you control us through fear. That ends today." Jim and Tom reached the central control room with minutes remaining. The original military facility showed its true purpose. Not weapons themselves, but proof of weapons. Evidence of conflicts and dangers the Shadow Valley had used to justify their control. They didn't build this, Jim realized. They found it, used it, built their whole system of control around managing the fear of what it represented. The countdown reached critical stages. Automated systems prepared to release proof of dangers the Shadow Valley had contained for decades. Evidence they believed would throw the region into chaos, proving the necessity of their control. But Blackwood had miscalculated. The world he'd built his plans around no longer existed. People faced with terrifying truths didn't collapse into panic and submission. They stood together, chose courage over fear. "You built everything on the assumption that humans need to be controlled," Maggie told him. "Never understood that real strength comes from standing together against threats, not hiding from them." The Shadow Valley's final gambit failed not through technical intervention but human choice. Their own operators, faced with the reality of what they were threatening, chose to stand down. Their automated systems, designed to prove the necessity of control, instead demonstrated its ultimate weakness. "They thought they were protecting humanity from itself," Dan observed, documenting the truth. "Never understood they were preventing us from growing stronger, from learning to face our fears together." The cartel representatives watched their life's work end. The system they'd built to maintain control through managed fear collapsed not from external attack, but internal choice. People at every level choosing truth over comfortable lies. Emma Parker coordinated the final securing of Shadow Valley facilities. "We'll be finding their hidden bunkers and secrets for years, but their power is broken. Their control through fear is finished." Blackwood faced his failure with final understanding. "We thought we were necessary, thought humanity needed our control to survive, never understood we were preventing the very strength we claimed to protect." Maggie watched federal teams begin dismantling the Shadow Valley's deepest facility. "Some things are more dangerous than truth," she said quietly. "Living in fear, letting people control us through threats, choosing comfort over courage." The war for Riverside Junction had evolved into something larger, a battle not just against one organization's control, but against the very idea that humanity needed to be controlled through fear. But as federal agents secured the last Shadow Valley facilities, new questions emerged. The network they'd built, the secrets they'd maintained, the conflicts they'd managed. Dismantling decades of control would trigger changes no one could fully predict. The immediate battle was ending, but the real challenge was just beginning, because building a world on truth and courage would prove harder than maintaining one based on fear and control. The next phase would test not just Riverside Junction, but humanity itself, and the choices made in the coming days would determine whether people could learn to live with truth rather than hide in comfortable lies. 1 year after the Shadow Valley's collapse, Riverside Junction had become something unexpected, a model for communities worldwide facing similar challenges. The town that had broken decades of controlled fear now demonstrated how to build something better in its place. Willow Creek Farm flourished in the Virginia spring, apple orchards blooming under clear skies. The underground facilities that had housed the Shadow Valley's secrets now served a different purpose. Education centers teaching future generations about the danger of accepting control through fear. They come from everywhere, Maggie told Jim during his regular visit home. People wanting to understand how we did it, how we stood together against manipulation. The town itself had transformed while maintaining its essential character. Grace Chen's diner remained a community hub, but now hosted international visitors studying how local unity had defeated sophisticated control. Jenny Thompson's bookstore expanded, becoming a center for community organization. That's what the Shadow Valley never understood, Grace observed, serving coffee to another group of studying officials. They thought people needed their control, never realized we're stronger without it. Dan Rodriguez's comprehensive expose of the Shadow Valley's operations had earned international recognition. His documentation of decades of manipulation became required reading in journalism schools and government academies. The story wasn't just about exposing corruption, he explained during a university lecture. It was about showing there's always a choice between accepting control through fear or standing together against real threats. Sheriff Emma Parker's reformed police department set new standards for law enforcement agencies worldwide, studying how she'd rebuilt from Shadow Valley corruption, creating a model based on community trust rather than authoritarian control. Start with truth, she advised visiting officials. Build trust through transparency. Remember who we're really protecting and why. Jim and Tom's military careers took new directions. Their experience dismantling the Shadow Valley's infrastructure led to specializing in exposing and preventing similar systems of control. They trained others to recognize and resist manipulation through manufactured fear. The Shadow Valley wasn't unique, Tom explained during a briefing, just the largest example of how control through fear infects societies. Understanding how they failed helps prevent it happening again. The underground facilities yielded their final secrets. Each revealed bunker provided new evidence of how deeply the Shadow Valley had influenced regional events. But more importantly, each discovery helped dismantle similar systems of control nationwide. They built everything on one false assumption, Jim noted, reviewing training materials, that people need to be controlled through fear. Every success in exposing them proves that assumption wrong. Victor Blackwood, serving life imprisonment, watched reports of positive changes with growing understanding. His life's work of maintaining control through fear had produced exactly what he claimed to be preventing: weakness, vulnerability, dependency on external control. I believed we were necessary, he told Maggie during her final visit. Thought humanity needed our protection. Never understood we were preventing people from developing real strength. The Shadow Valley's board members faced justice. Their trials exposed decades of manipulation, but their greatest punishment was watching communities worldwide choose unity over fear, cooperation over control, truth over comfortable lies. They're still waiting for chaos, Dan observed, documenting the changes. Can't understand that people facing truth together are stronger than any amount of control through fear. The town's example inspired others. Communities worldwide studied how Riverside Junction had maintained unity against manipulation, how they'd chosen courage over comfort, truth over control, solidarity over submission. That's the real legacy, Maggie told a documentary crew. Not just exposing their lies, but showing there's a better way. That humans facing challenges together are stronger than any system of control. Grace Chen's diner hosted regular community meetings where residents shared their experiences with visitors. The story of resistance against the Shadow Valley became a story of choosing a different way forward. They thought isolating us would make us vulnerable, Grace explained to another study group. Instead, it showed us what real community means, how standing together makes us stronger than any external control. Emma Parker's department demonstrated new approaches to maintaining order, not through fear or force, but through community trust and transparent operation. Her officers became examples of protection without intimidation. The Shadow Valley controlled through fear of what might happen without them, she explained to Police Academy graduates. We protect by helping communities stand together against real threats. The underground facilities found new purposes. Research centers studied how to prevent systems of control. Education programs taught recognition of manipulation through fear. Each repurposed bunker demonstrated victory of truth over hidden lies. The infrastructure they built to maintain control now helps prevent it, Tom noted during an inspection. Perfect example of choosing better purposes for existing resources. Jim's military career focused increasingly on prevention, teaching others to recognize and resist manipulation through fear, helping communities maintain strength through unity rather than submission to control. The Shadow Valley's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their secrets, he explained during training. It was convincing people they needed external control to be safe. Breaking that belief is our most important mission. Dan Rodriguez's continued investigation revealed similar systems worldwide, but each exposure led to communities choosing resistance over submission. The Shadow Valley's collapse became a model for dismantling control through fear. Their greatest fear is coming true, he wrote in his latest article. People are learning to stand together against manipulation, choosing truth over comfort, courage over control. Willow Creek Farm became a symbol of resistance against fear-based control. Visitors studied not just what had happened, but how. Ordinary people choosing courage over comfort could defeat massive systems of manipulation. The land endures, Maggie told Jim during their regular evening talks. But it's the people who matter, how they choose to live, what they choose to believe, whether they stand together or submit to control through fear. The Shadow Valley's collapse triggered not chaos, but awakening. Communities worldwide recognized and rejected manipulation. Through fear, chose unity over isolation, courage over comfort, truth over control. That's the real victory, Maggie observed, watching another sunset over her orchards. Not just exposing their lies, but showing there's a better way forward. That humans standing together can face any challenge without submitting to control through fear. The war for Riverside Junction had ended, but its example continued inspiring others, showing that ordinary people choosing courage over comfort, unity over isolation, truth over lies, could defeat any system of control through fear. Because some things are stronger than fear, some truths more powerful than lies, some victories not about defeating enemies, but about choosing better ways to face life's real challenges together. In truth, without fear. The Riverside Junction Chronicles headline hit like thunderbolt. Beyond the Shadows, the untold story of Virginia's largest conspiracy. Dan Rodriguez's comprehensive report detailed the full scope of what had been uncovered in the months following. The Shadow Valley's collapse, reaching far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. At Willow Creek Farm, Maggie sat at her kitchen table with Jim and Tom, reviewing the article. It goes deeper than even we knew, Jim noted, pointing to key passages. The underground network, the government connections, the international ties. More. They were building something bigger than just a drug operation. The truth had emerged slowly over months of investigation. The Shadow Valley's facilities hadn't just been about controlling local territory. They were part of a vast network of similar operations across multiple states, all connected through sophisticated underground infrastructure dating back to The Cold War. Look at this. Tom spread out newly declassified maps. Every major trafficking corridor in the eastern United States has one of these facilities. They weren't just moving drugs, they were creating a shadow infrastructure, parallel, supply lines that could operate completely off the grid. Dan Rodriguez arrived with fresh documents. Just got these from a source in the Defense Department. The original tunnels were part of a classified contingency program called Project Echo, meant to be emergency infrastructure if conventional systems failed. But somewhere along the way, someone realized they could use it for something else, Jim finished. Perfect cover, old military installations, officially abandoned, already set up for covert operations. At the Sheriff's Department, Emma Parker coordinated with federal task forces as more evidence emerged. Each discovery revealed new layers of the conspiracy. Local officials who'd worked with the Shadow Valley were connected to state politicians, who in turn had ties to international criminal organizations. It's like peeling an onion, Emma explained during a briefing. Every layer we remove exposes something bigger. The drug trade was just the surface. They were building a complete parallel power structure. Victor Blackwood's trial had opened new avenues of investigation. Facing life imprisonment, he'd finally begun talking, revealing connections that reached into the highest levels of government and business. "You still don't understand the full scope," he told federal investigators. "We weren't just criminals, we were insurance, a backup system for when legitimate channels failed. Every major corporation, every government agency needed our network, whether they admitted it or not." The revelations sparked international investigations. Similar facilities were discovered across the country, each tied to local criminal organizations that maintained the same facade. Outlaw bikers or street gangs that were actually managing sophisticated infrastructure networks. Grace Chen's diner had become a hub for investigators and journalists following the story. "Each day brings new discoveries," she told customers over coffee. "But the biggest change isn't what they're finding underground, it's what's happening up here," in how people think about control and fear. Jenny Thompson's bookstore now hosted weekly community meetings where people shared their experiences and discussed how to prevent similar systems from taking root again. "That's what they really fear," Jenny explained to a documentary crew. "Not that we exposed their operation, but that we proved communities can stand together without being controlled through fear." The underground facilities continued yielding secrets. Federal teams discovered sophisticated communications equipment, data centers that had monitored government and corporate activities, evidence of decades of manipulation. "They didn't just build a criminal enterprise," Tom reported during a military briefing. "They built a complete shadow government, ready to step in whenever legitimate authority failed. The perfect insurance policy for people in power." Maggie's farm had become a symbol of resistance, but also of transformation. The old tunnels beneath her property were being converted into a research center, studying how communities could recognize and resist systematic manipulation. "The land remembers," she told visitors. "But it's not just about remembering the fear and control. It's about teaching future generations to choose courage and truth instead." International law enforcement agencies began discovering similar patterns worldwide. Criminal organizations that had evolved beyond traditional illegal activities, building and maintaining shadow infrastructure that legitimate powers relied on but never officially acknowledged. Iduide Bichon. It's a parallel world, Dan wrote in his follow-up article. Hidden in plain sight, maintained through fear and denial, used by the very authorities meant to fight it, until one small town chose to stand up and expose the truth. Jim's military career increasingly focused on identifying and dismantling these shadow networks. Each operation revealed the same pattern: Sophisticated infrastructure masked by seemingly simple criminal activities, all maintained through careful manipulation of fear. They all make the same mistake, he explained during a training session. They assume people need to be controlled through fear, never understand that courage and unity are stronger than any amount of manipulation. Emma Parker's department became a model for other communities dealing with similar discoveries. The key isn't just exposing corruption, she advised visiting officials. It's showing people they have the strength to stand together against it. At the federal level, investigations continued expanding. Each Shadow Valley connection led to another criminal network, another hidden facility, another layer of the parallel infrastructure they'd helped maintain. We're not just dismantling a criminal organization, the lead FBI investigator announced. We're exposing a system that's been operating in the shadows for decades, manipulating everything from local politics to international relations. As the story grew, Riverside Junction remained its heart. The town that had first exposed the truth now demonstrated how to rebuild something better, transparent, united, based on courage rather than fear. They thought they were creating stability through control, Maggie observed during another evening talk with Jim. Never understood that real stability comes from people choosing to stand together, to face truth instead of hiding in comfortable lies. The Shadow Valley's collapse had triggered a cascade of revelations that continued spreading. Each exposure led to more discoveries, more evidence of how deeply the parallel world had penetrated legitimate society. But more importantly, each revelation showed communities worldwide that they had a choice: continue accepting control through fear or stand together and choose a different path. The final piece of the Shadow Valley puzzle emerged not from their sophisticated underground networks or hidden documents, but from an unexpected source. Harold Jenkins, Riverside Junction's elderly town historian, had been quietly collecting information for decades, piecing together a pattern that everyone else had missed. It wasn't just about the tunnels or the drugs, he explained to Jim and Tom in his cluttered office. Look at the dates, the land purchases, the seemingly random events. They were following a plan laid out over 50 years ago. Jenkins spread out yellowed newspapers, old property records, and faded photographs across his desk. Each piece added to a larger picture, one that showed the Shadow Valley's rise wasn't accidental. They had been carefully positioned, guided by unseen hands, to create something far more significant than a mere criminal enterprise. At Willow Creek Farm, Maggie hosted a meeting with federal investigators and intelligence analysts. The evidence Jenkins had uncovered painted a disturbing picture. The Shadow Valley wasn't just part of a network. They were a test case, a prototype for how entire regions could be controlled through carefully managed fear and corruption. They chose places like Riverside Junction deliberately. Dan Rodriguez explained, connecting the dots in his latest investigation. Small communities, strategic locations, strong local traditions, perfect laboratories for developing their methods of control. Emma Parker brought in files from police archives dating back to the 1960s. Every major change in our town's history was influenced somehow. Property sales, business closures, even natural disasters. They used everything to gradually tighten their grip. Tom's military intelligence background helped him see the bigger pattern. They were developing a playbook, he told the assembled group, testing different methods of control, seeing what worked best. Everything that happened here was documented, analyzed, and refined for use elsewhere. The revelation sparked a new wave of investigations nationwide. Other communities began discovering similar patterns in their own histories, seemingly unrelated events that, viewed together, showed the same deliberate manipulation. We weren't just fighting local criminals, Jim observed during a federal task force briefing. We were dismantling a decades-long social experiment, one that was meant to be replicated across the country. Grace Chen's diner had become more than just a meeting place. It was now a center for community resistance studies. Researchers and activists came from around the world to learn how a small town had broken free from such a sophisticated system of control. The most important lesson, Grace told them, isn't about the specific tactics we used. It's about understanding that fear only works if people stay isolated. Connection is the antidote to control. In the converted Shadow Valley compound, now a training center for law enforcement and community leaders, Jenny Thompson led workshops on recognizing the signs of systematic manipulation. They left blueprints, she explained, showing surveillance footage from the final days, not just for their operations, but for how to break communities down, how to replace natural connections with artificial control. The underground facilities, once symbols of hidden power, were being transformed. Each repurposed room and tunnel became part of a living museum, teaching future generations about the importance of vigilance and unity. Maggie walked these converted spaces with a sense of vindication. They built all this to maintain control through fear, she told visitors. Now it stands as proof that courage and community are stronger than any amount of manipulation. The international implications continued growing. Intelligence agencies worldwide began identifying similar prototype communities, places where the Shadow Valley's methods had been refined and replicated. It's like a virus, Dan wrote in his final article on the subject. Once you know the pattern, you can see how it spreads. But like any virus, it can only survive if the host remains weakened and isolated. Jim's military career evolved into something new. He began developing training programs to help other communities recognize and resist systematic manipulation. The Shadow Valley wasn't the disease, he explained during a Pentagon briefing. They were just one symptom of a larger problem, the belief that people need to be controlled through fear. Breaking that belief is our real mission. Emma Parker's department became a model for community-based law enforcement. Her officers learned to recognize the difference between genuine protection and systematic control. True security doesn't come from fear, she told a graduating class of new officers. It comes from trust, transparency, and community connection. Everything the Shadow Valley tried to destroy. Harold Jenkins continued piecing together the historical record, ensuring that the full story would be preserved for future generations. The most dangerous part of their system, he noted, cataloging another set of documents, wasn't the criminal activities or the corruption. It was how they made people believe that control through fear was normal, even necessary. At Willow Creek Farm, life settled into a new rhythm. The apple orchards still bloomed each spring, but now they stood for something more, a reminder that growth and renewal are possible even after decades of manipulation. The land heals, Maggie told Jim during one of their evening talks. And so do people, once they realize they don't have to live in fear. The Shadow Valley's legacy had been transformed. What was built as a system of control had become a testament to human resilience and the power of community. They thought they were writing a manual for control, Tom observed during the final conversion of the compound. Instead, they created a warning about the importance of staying connected, staying brave. As Riverside Junction moved forward, its example continued inspiring others. Communities worldwide learned that the first step toward freedom wasn't fighting external enemies. It was choosing to stand together against the internal fears that made control possible. That's the real story here, Dan concluded in his last report. Not just how one town broke free from a sophisticated system of control, but how they proved that courage and connection are the natural state of human communities. Fear and isolation have to be carefully manufactured and maintained. The moment people choose to stand together, the whole system falls apart. The sun set on another day in Riverside Junction, painting the Blue Ridge Mountains in shades of gold and purple. From her porch, Maggie watched the town she'd helped free continue growing, changing, showing others the way forward. They tried to write our story for us, she told a final group of visitors, tried to make us believe we needed their kind of control. But in the end, we wrote our own story, one about courage, community, and the kind of strength that can only come from standing together in truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.